Okay, so there will be spoilers in this video, but basically I'm gonna set out to fully explain this movie and all the symbolism in it and everything that's going on, because I think the first time you watch it, it can definitely be super just bizarre and weird in a really confusing way. But that kind of made me obsess over it, and the more I thought about it over the next several days after I saw it, the more I felt like I kind of got what they were going for. So I thought it would be a cool idea to make a video trying to explain as much of this as possible. So I made some extensive notes and I'm going to just try to run through the whole movie. So the main point that I want to make in this video is that like the whole thing that's going on in the movie is that rather than a paranormal or demonic force terrorizing the house and Harper as the main character, rather than some kind of ghost or demon or whatever you would normally have in a horror movie, the evil force that terrorizes her is the personification of the concept of toxic masculinity. And so basically everything that happens is a manifestation of men blaming her for her husband's death and trying to like shame her and demonize her within her place in society. So before the start of the film, her husband dies tragically and she goes to this country estate to try and process that and heal as much as she can. When she gets there, Geoffrey, the guy that she's renting it from, shows her around the house and he makes a few awkward comments that kind of set the stage for men being like weird and creepy. He says something about like, you know, when's your husband coming? Is he coming later on? And she like doesn't really know how to respond. And then when he shows her the bathroom, he says we have to tell all the ladies to only flush toilet paper, insinuating, that she shouldn't flush any feminine products. And that's something that you would only say to a woman. Obviously, a man's not going to do that. So it's kind of like singling women out in an awkward way and kind of starts to plant those seeds of men being like creeps, even though just him saying that isn't like super horrible compared to everything that happens later on. It kind of starts to set the stage for all that. So after he shows her around, she takes a walk through the woods and kind of explores the whole area that she's going to be staying in. She ends up getting caught in the rain, but when she takes cover under a tree, she kind of like smiles and laughs. And I kind of interpreted that to mean even though she's caught in the rain, she's able to briefly not think about all the traumatic stuff she's been through. So it's kind of like a moment where she's able to just be in the moment. And it's kind of a little bit of a release for her. But then quickly after that, she sees the naked man when she's making all the sounds in the little tunnel she finds. She sees the naked man at the end and he starts running towards her. And then she takes a picture of an abandoned house and she captures the naked man in the picture. And so this whole naked guy, I took him as a symbol for the whole idea of patriarchy, which is the inclination towards male dominance in society. And, that's existed throughout history and it kind of follows women around as they try to go about their lives and navigate the world. Society is essentially dominated by men in the whole kind of mentality that, the framework that the movie's creating. Um, So she's followed around by a very direct symbol of masculinity, which is his exposed genitals, this naked guy. So the next day, she's back chilling at the house, and the naked guy shows up and is like peering through the windows and everything. So she calls the police, and they come and arrest him. And then her friend's telling her, you should get out of there. There's no way you should stay after all that. But she's like, no, I made it out here. Like, I'm not going to let another man ruin things for me. So I'm going to stay. I'm going to go tour the town and so on and so forth. So she ends up going to view the local historic church that's nearby, and this is kind of the point where um, it kind of steps up from Geoffrey making awkward comments to men kind of blatantly disrespecting and demonizing her in a really inappropriate way. So she sees the little boy outside, and he's wearing a mask of a woman's face. And obviously, in society, masks are kind of equated with dressing up for Halloween and trying to like role play being scary or whatever. But the mask that he's wearing is a woman's face. So that kind of represents men demonizing women, viewing them as monstrous, so on and so forth. And then the boy asks her to play hide and seek, and she says, "Oh, I'm really not in the mood," or whatever. And then he like cusses her out and takes it to a 10 and starts cursing at her. So it's like a vicious response to her just like, not being interested in him. And that's obviously like a very toxic male response. So then she starts talking to the vicar, which, if you're American, that's just like a term for a priest, but we'd like never use that term. Um, but she starts talking to him and basically tells him the full story of everything that happened with her husband. That she told him she wanted a divorce, and then as soon as she brought that up, he started to threaten to kill himself if she left him. And then it all kind of culminated in him eventually physically punching her in the face. And when that happened, she obviously like just kicked him out and told him to leave. And after she kicked him out, he broke into the apartment above theirs and fell from their balcony, fell to his death. And it's kind of unclear, even to her, whether he purposely jumped since he had been threatening to kill himself, or if he just kind of slipped trying to get back into their apartment. But as she's talking to the vicar about this, he's like trying to be comforting, but he kind of uses it as an opportunity to be a creep and like awkwardly rubs on her thigh in a really inappropriate way. And it seems like he's trying to be comforting at first, but then it takes like a drastic turn. And he basically directly implies to her that it's her fault that her husband fell to his death. He says to her straight up, if you wouldn't have kicked him out, this wouldn't have happened. So this is like a very direct expression of the kind of toxic male tendency to blame the victim in a situation of domestic abuse. Obviously, she's the victim. Obviously, threatening to kill yourself if someone leaves you is emotional manipulation and abuse. Obviously, physically hitting someone is abuse, is a crime. But the vicar still, he literally says, "Oh, sometimes men hit women. It just happens. If you wouldn't have kicked him out, he wouldn't have ended up falling to his death." So he directly blames her, even though she's clearly the victim of multiple forms of abuse in her relationship. And that's obviously incorrect. His opinion is obviously wrong, but that's the kind of evil, toxic male viewpoint that becomes the source of the horror and all the haunted house stuff that follows. So this scene kind of directly expresses that toxic viewpoint. So obviously she like storms away, doesn't want to hear any of that. So she goes to the pub to have a drink, and she sees one of the cops that came to arrest the naked man, and he says that they had to let the naked man go because there was nothing to charge him with. And she says, "What do you mean? He was clearly stalking me." And the guy just kind of like looks at her and is like, "You saw him twice. How he probably didn't even notice you." So he just basically completely dismisses everything she's been through and kind of the traumatic experience of this naked guy showing up and stalking her. The cop is just completely dismissive of her viewpoint, and that's another expression of that toxic masculinity, that he's just dismissing her experience and her trauma and acting like she's being crazy. You know what I mean? So she ends up going back to the house, and this is kind of the point where all the haunted house. Scary stuff happens. The lights start flashing off and on. She sees a cop standing outside, and she walks out and he won't even respond to her, and she's just like, "What are you doing here? Why will you not say anything?" And then the lights flash again and he disappears. She goes back in the house, one of the windows shatters, and it's just like starting to get kind of scary movie, crazy stuff happening. So after a few minutes, Geoffrey appears and he says that he heard her yelling and came to see what was going on. And she's like, there's someone outside again. They threw something through the window, so on and so forth. And Geoffrey kind of feels the like stereotypical masculine responsibility to be the strong man and protect her. And he says something about like, my father said you'd never be good enough for the military or whatever. So he feels like he has to try and defend his masculinity by going out and seeing what's going on. So he goes out and then the lights flash and he disappears. And so I feel like at the beginning of the movie, when he's kind of making awkward comments, that's just kind of him being ignorant, but he's not being fully aggressive towards her in the same way that the young boy and the vicar are. But I feel like when Geoffrey tries to fully embrace that overly masculine protector role and chooses to go out, at that point he's kind of taken by this evil force of the toxic masculinity, and he's converted into that when he overly subscribes to the masculine role of, oh, I have to be the defender, so on and so forth. So she like ends up going outside. The naked man appears and blows dandelion spores into her face. And there's several scenes before this where you see the spores floating around. And I kind of took that to be another symbol for the pervasive male dominance in society, and that it's kind of seen as part of nature, part of human nature, the symbol of a flower as a natural part of nature. It kind of equates to this idea that men hold that male dominance is a natural thing. So the naked man blows the spores into her face, and then one like goes down into her mouth and she swallows it. And then after that is when she goes in the house and he puts his hand through the mail slot, and she ends up stabbing him in his hand, and he tries to pull it back and the knife is like wedged, and so it basically completely splits his hand in half. And it's really gross and traumatic. But I think the whole point here is that even though he's terrorizing her and coming at her, and she's clearly the one who is the normal person having all the horror movie stuff happen to her, despite all of that, she's the one that actually inflicts damage. So I kind of take it as like he blows the spores and she kind of swallows like this toxic masculine idea that's like pervasive all around her. And then when he's sticking his hand through the slot, she actually reaches out to grab his hand. And then obviously he's pulling back because he's the crazy bad guy. And she ends up having to stab him. But the whole point is that she's the one that inflicts damage. They're there terrorizing her, but she's the one that actually does harm to him. And that kind of relates to this whole toxic male theme. Because even though they're terrorizing her, all the men are clearly the scary ones and the bad guys. Despite all of that, the lens is kind of turned back to her, and she is the one that actually does damage. And then, kind of an important point here is that after the guy gets his hand sliced in half like that, all the other men, when they appear, they have the same injury. All of their hands are sliced like that. And I took this to kind of symbolize that all of the men are like one entity. They're all a manifestation of the same toxic male mentality. And then at the same time, all of the injuries that all of them sustain, all of the injuries that all of them sustain throughout this whole section of the movie are the same injuries that her husband would have gotten when he fell from the building. His hand snagged on the fence and ripped in half like that. So it all kind of goes back to the trauma that she suffered with everything that happened with her husband. So, she's running, getting chased around the house, all this. The masked kid shows up and his hands split too. And he's talking about hide and seek more and, trying to force her to do what he wants, have his way. She ends up blocking herself off in one of the bedrooms, and the vicar shows up and he starts quoting Yeats and a bunch of other poetry that centers around female sensuality corrupting men in different ways. So he's essentially blaming her for the sexual temptation that he feels around her. And all of this kind of culminates in him gesturing towards her hips and saying, "What is this?" And then he's getting too close. And so she presses the knife to him. And he says, "Oh, exactly. This is the tip of the knife." Kind of assuming that a woman's sexuality is evil and harmful to men. So kind of demonizing women for their sexuality, which is obviously another toxic male thing to do, a toxic way to think. So she ends up fleeing from the house. Geoffrey's standing in the middle of the road, and at this point, he's kind of been converted to the whole toxic guy. She ends up hitting him with the car, and he calls her Miss and then corrects himself and says, Miss. He says MISS and then he corrects himself to MRS, implying that she's dominated by a man and lacks independence. So she ends up fleeing back to the house, and then the final kind of climactic scene is when all of the men birth each other. And I feel like when you watch it, it's just really bizarre and grotesque, and it's just confusing and weird. But I think that, like, when you see past that, it's a lot more obvious and direct of a symbol than it seems when you first just get caught up in how gross and bizarre it is. So I think the whole point here, when they're all birthing each other, is that when the men become the most grotesque, the most horrific and monstrous, they take on feminine features. They grow pregnant, they grow vaginas, and give birth. So this is a metaphor for gaslighting and victim blaming. And so even though they're becoming extremely horrific, the fault is given to women. They take on feminine features when they become the most horrific, because in their view, no matter how horrible or evil a man acts, they somehow shift the fault and the blame to women. So when they become the most evil and horrible, they take on feminine features. And then beyond that, I think that this scene um, can also be interpreted as representing men passing on toxic traits to future generations as well. And so they all birth each other, and then her husband is the last one to be birthed. And he sits down next to her on the couch, and she just says, "What do you want from me?" And he says, "Oh, I just want your love." So even though they've put her through this whole horrific experience, in his mind, it's no issue and it's justified. And, oh, his intentions are pure. He just wants to still be with her. So it's like he's denying that the men are even the monsters because, she's the one that didn't want to be with him. It's her fault. He had to jump off the building because she wanted a divorce. So everything that happens, all the horrific stuff, the men are attempting to shift the blame onto Harper. and to demonize her, not just because of her actions or anything she's done, but because of her femininity. And that's kind of, to me, that was the whole point that the movie was getting at. The evil force isn't something supernatural. It's just the fact that men can be super toxic towards women. And that's like the whole point of the movie, in my opinion. So hopefully this kind of made sense. Might have to edit this down. I think this might be too long to post fully to YouTube, but I'm gonna put all of my notes in the description. If you want to read over that, if you think that might help clarify anything a little more, if you have any specific questions or anything, let me know in the comments, and I'll try to answer any specific questions you might have the best I can. If you like this video, let me know of any other movies that confuse you that you'd like to see me try to explain. I do realize it might seem ironic that you could say I'm mansplaining a a movie about some pretty feminist type of stuff, but I just like after I watched this, it made me kind of think like, is there anything I do when I interact with women that makes them feel awkward or in some way, demonizes them or is inappropriate? So I feel like it kind of caused me to like evaluate my own behavior. So I hope that explaining this can do the same for other men. Um, yeah, so I guess subscribe to this channel if you like this video and you want to see any more. And yeah, let me know your thoughts.